Hello and welcome. In this tutorial, we're going to look at the process of taking a model that you've made in Cinema4d and basically making it ready for export to a video game engine. And specifically, we're going to also be looking at the use of an LOD, which means level of detail. And what that means is that you can essentially have objects, the same object with different levels of geometry, be swapped out for one another as you get closer or further from the camera, or the object gets closer and further from the camera. This can be really helpful for optimizing things for game engines, especially if you're porting stuff to something that doesn't have a lot of processing power and you're making assets for something like that. Being able to kind of know this process and how to get your textures and everything to map effectively is really useful for creating game assets and is an important part of the pipeline. Okay, so to start with, if you're in the class, you will have access to this model. If you're not in the class, I might be able to set this up as a course on YouTube and have this asset available. I haven't actually experimented with that very much. YouTube just sort of decided to make my models or some of my things courses already. All right, let's see here. Let's switch to the right side. So if you are not in the class, you can kind of just mimic what I've done here. It's not a crazy model. I just have my spline in a lathe. And in this case, this is solid, right? It's not a void. And if I was doing something where I did want this to have wall thickness that you were able to see through, I could go ahead and do that. But in this case, I wanted to keep the UV unwrapping part of this tutorial simple, or as simple as possible. And so I left this as a solid object, right? And then for a lot of lower tier hardware, you're not going to be able to accurately render something that has transparency anyway. So we want to do something that's more solid. Okay, so that is our basic setup. Okay. So you'll see that this looks pretty good as it currently stands. However, you might notice there is like a little bit of strangeness in here. And if I go to display and change to lines, you're going to see what's happening, right? The default settings for a spline mean that it's set to this interpolation is set to adaptive. And what that means is basically if there's more change in angle over a certain distance, it's going to create more subdivisions, and if there's less change in an angle, it'll create fewer. This can be really useful for reducing the total polygon count on a model. However, it can also introduce some strange artifacts when you start taking this out of Cinema4d. And so you can see how this looks. Now, one of the things that is working in our benefit right now is that we have a Phong tag. And what a Phong tag does, if you're unfamiliar, is it basically fakes some of the rounding and smoothness that you see on this model. So if I say display and go back to just the shading view, you'll see that I've got what looks to be pretty smooth. However, if I take this Phong angle down to 0, I'm going to get a very faceted appearance. And so in this case, that's what this is going to look like when we export it. Right, we'll have these, pretty uniform sections here, but then we're going to have some harder angles in some of these other parts. And that's not necessarily something we would be interested in. And it's also going to lead to a fair amount of potential distortion in our mesh and in our ability to draw things to this surface. And so the other thing is it's always good when you're starting to work on things to export that you turn your Phong angle down, or you can even just delete the tag entirely so that you have some sense of what the mesh is going to look like as soon as it leaves Cinema4d. So the next step in our process then is going to be to change our interpolation, right? So there are several different options here. First, we can just turn it off, and this is going to give us the most basic mesh you can possibly imagine, right? Every corner is hard, and that could be really useful. Again, if you're doing something very, very simple, this would potentially be an effective way to work. There are a couple other options in here, and through experimentation, I found that natural, and this should be set to 8. Here we go. Right, natural is going to be our best bet, and I'm going to show you here basically at the top of the lid where we actually have this rounding happening. If I go ahead and turn my lines back on, I want you to see that, right, if I go to uniform, we're going to get a much more blunt experience up here. And that may be perfectly fine for what we're doing. But if this edge is important, if you want to keep some of that rounding there so you get a nice highlight on this potentially, that is something you need to pay attention to, right? And it really depends. If I go to uniform, there we go, sorry. If I go to natural, you'll see I get rounding, but the polygons are denser. And if I go to subdivided, I'm going to get much denser polygons here and much more open polygons in these other areas. And so this is something where, again, any of these are perfectly viable. It just depends on, like, I don't need all of those polygons in there, right? That's a lot of wasted energy going into that section. And so I thought that natural is probably the best bet. And then it's always good to go ahead and step down a little bit and see, like, is there a point, what's the lowest possible point where I'm going to get a result I'm happy with, right? And what we're doing right now is we're going to make our highest resolution version of this model. And so we want to start with LOD. We want to start with the highest resolution, and then we're going to go ahead and make it lower and lower and lower resolution. You can see, right, I'm starting to get like more faceting on the surface here. And so, right, the question is, where's this point that's going to be, most useful for me? And I found if I was going to go, moderately high in terms of polygons, at least to start with, 10 points in my interpolation means that I get, the most reliably close polygon mesh. Now, something else I can do, if I wanted to increase or decrease the rotational segments, I need to select my lathe generator, and I need to come down here to subdivisions, right? And I could, if I really wanted to crank this up, I could make this like 64. Then I'm going to get a much smoother appearance across this bottle. And you can see if I go back to shading, I'm still going to have this faceted look. But part of this is kind of determining, like, well, what's acceptable. And that's going to be based on the system you're developing for and what it can handle and how close this object's actually going to be to the camera, right? If it's this far away, I'm probably not going to notice some of those facets. If I get really, really close, obviously that's going to become more clear. And so that's something that we'll need to pay attention to as we go. So let's say we're all even, we're going to go ahead and let's say our subdivisions here, I'm going to leave them at 32. And part of this is I'm making this a little bit lower resolution just so that it's a little easier to see what's happening when we do the UV unwrapping. So I've got my generator here, right, making this thing. Now, if I was to try and export this out of Cinema4d right now, it wouldn't work because generators don't exist outside of Cinema4d. Each 3D rendering software will have its own generators, but in this case, right, this isn't going to pass cleanly into Unity or anything else. I need this to be a polygon mesh. And so the first thing I'm going to need to do that is I might actually want to save these settings, and I'm just going to delete the word start here. And so I have my base mesh. Now, the next thing I need to do is I'm going to need to make this editable. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to say, I can either say make editable or connect objects and delete. Either one of those is going to create this solid object here, right? So this is a polygon object at this point. I'm in points mode, which is why it looks like this. If I go to model mode, I should get a solid object, right? All sorts of different possibilities here. Now, the other thing is that it generated all of these different tags here, right? So the first tag, this grid, this is a UVW tag. This is going to be important. If you haven't done any UV editing previously, I would suggest you check out my UV editing tutorials or someone else's. I have a pair that right now that are just really basic on sort of the idea behind it. And then these are all polygon selection tags, and these are edge selection tags. And so if I select the first one, and you'll see I get all these settings down here under attributes. If I hit select, it's going to select all the polygons, right? If I go to this next one and I say select, it's going to deselect all the polygons. And I know from experience that all of these are empty. I'm not quite sure what they're attached to, but I'm going to leave this one in case I want to use it. But these other ones that are empty, I'm going to select those, and I'm just going to go ahead and delete that. And then for this other stuff, right, if I hit select here, I won't see anything because I'm in polygon mode. But if I go to edges mode, you can see I have a single line here. And what this is this is actually the edge that Cinema4d used to unpeel this UV, right? It's already, when I made it editable, it already unpeeled the surface texture for us. However, it didn't do a great job, and we'll look at that in a second. But this edge is useful to us. And again, just like the, let's see here, just like the other one, like this has two that are the same edge. If I select this right now, there's nothing there. There's no edges selected whatsoever on the model. So really, I just need that first one again. So I'm going to go ahead and select all the rest of these and get rid of them. And the reason that I'm getting rid of most of these is just so it's not clogged up. And when I put my materials on there, they aren't like hidden on the side of the screen. Okay, so we've got this base mesh done. Fantastic. Now, and this is going to be, again, right, this is our highest polygon copy potentially. We can actually use the tool. We're going to use the remesher to make it even higher polygon mesh if we want to. But this is our good starting point, right? We've preserved the detail and we're ready to start making edits to our UVs. So we're going to go to UV edit. And I want you to see that, right, this is the bottle completely laid out on this surface. Now, if I was to go ahead and over here, if your window's a little bigger, textures should just show up. If I put my UV W map on here, you can see where the red side and the green side connect, right? On that edge that I said is where things have been essentially wrapped around and wrapped to. And you'll see that it's the mesh is glued on here and there's some distortion happening on the surface. But the biggest problem is going to be up on the top, right? Where everything's coming to this single point. And the same goes for here on this edge where things are being smeared across that surface. They're also, although it's not quite as important and not as noticeable, they are being smeared across this surface. You can actually see there's an edge right here that should be the same thickness as this, that's like really spread out around here. And so we've got a couple areas where we have problems with this mesh that it would be great if we could resolve. And the same thing is happening on the base of the mesh. I'm going to go through this process pretty quickly because I do, oops, I did not need to grab that. I do have this other tutorial that covers this a bit more in depth. So this should ideally be remedial. And then there'll be a couple other changes we're going to need to make. But the first thing is we want to select all of our polygon islands that we want that are going to be, that are currently being smeared around the poles of this thing, right? That have like essentially polar coordinates. And we want to lay them flat so that like this circle is laying flat on this mesh or on this image so that we can actually put artwork on here and not have it look totally distorted and strange. And so to do that, we are going to go ahead and go to our Phong break selection tool. And with Phong break, right, what it does is you'll see that there's these darker lines in here. And I'm going to make sure I'm in polygon mode. But there's these darker lines in here where it's basically chopping these into smaller pieces. And so I'm going to go ahead and select this top disk. And I could, because I don't care if this edge is a little bit distorted, I know that like in this case, this would, it's not going to be that big of an issue for me. And it's going to save us time. So I'm going to go ahead and select that as well. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit and make sure I've got everything selected. It looks like I do. Okay, so I've got those selected. So this is one island that I'm going to have. Okay, so I've got my polygon selected. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to, in the previous tutorial that I showed how to relax UVs, this is the tool I used down here in the UV manager. I clicked on relax UVs, made sure everything was unchecked, and I hit apply. And in the previous tutorial, it worked well, and this was a continuous thing. But in this case, you can see that there's a gap here, and that's going to make texturing this kind of obnoxious. And so I'm going to undo that step. And in this case, what I need to do is I need to do a weld and relax. And what that means is that because there's this edge here, that's the edge that's sort of showing up in this in the model here that's problematic. And so what we're going to do is we're going to say we want to relax it. We want to make it the shape we want it to be, but we also want to weld it together. And so I'm going to go ahead and click on the gear before I click on the button, because I want to make sure my settings look like this. I want auto realign, use pins for UV relax, and restrict to polygon selection needs to be selected as well. Otherwise, it's going to do it to the entire bottle, and that's not going to be great for us. So I'm going to click on that. Now I have a circle that's absolutely usable and is contiguous. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my move tool here. Actually, I'm going to grab my UV transform tool, and I'm just going to drag this up and out of the way for the time being, right? And you can already see, right, now I have this flat thing, and you can imagine if this was any other image, it would actually look correct on the top of the surface, which is exactly what we want. So now I'm going to move down a little ways, and I'm going to go ahead and go back to polygon mode and use my Phong break selection and start selecting some of these other areas. I'm going to leave this alone, but I'm going to go ahead and zoom in, and I'm going to grab that chunk, this chunk, and this chunk, right? And I want these to be an island as well. I'm going to use UV weld and relax again. And that should make a continuous circle. And you can see it's absolutely massive, but that's fine. We're going to, again, grab our transform tool, drag this somewhere else so that we just have a bit more space to, to deal with, and we don't have things overlapped currently. Then I'm going to rotate my view down below, and I'm going to use my Phong break selection tool again. And I'm going to do the exact same thing for the bottom surface here. So I'm going to click on that, hold shift and make sure I get all of those polygons and make sure there isn't a little weird gap in there, which it looks like everything's good to go. So then I can go ahead and do the same thing. Now, no, I don't have to click on the gear every time. I can just click on the button now, and I'm going to get the same result. So I can go back here, grab this tool, drag these polygons over here somewhere. And now the last one that I really need to do at this point is the bottom of this glass jar. So let's go ahead and see if we can select this. Now, when I try and do this, I'm actually getting the entire thing is being selected. And so what I need to do on my Phong break tool is I need to adjust the number of degrees. And I found if I put this up to about 50 or 48's a little low. If I go a little over 50, oh, let's see. Let's keep going. No, or do I have to go below? Oh, sorry, I went the wrong way. Okay, so I've selected my Phong break tool, and now I've found that it's actually trying to select this entire thing. It's not selecting the rounded part of the geometry there. So I actually need to adjust my angle down a little bit, somewhere around 12 or 13 degrees. Let's go down a little lower. And let's just make this 12 degrees, not 122 degrees, but 12. There we go. So now you can see I'm getting this really right at the base edge there. I'm going to go ahead and rotate my view and see. Yeah, this seems like it's pretty good. I might want to see if I can do like 12.1. Let's see if I can get around that corner a little bit more with this selection. Let's see here, it looks like it's right on that edge there, which would be kind of nice. There is some rounding there. It might be better to go up a few more. Let's just see if I can go. Oh, if I go up to 12.3, it's too much. So I have to go here and select this. And then again, I might just go ahead and leave those. It's not going to be that much distortion on the bottom edge. If I needed to, something that's a more advanced technique is I could actually make cuts on all of these so they lay more flat. For the time being, we're just going to go ahead and select this section. Again, UV weld and relax. Now we've got that. You can see it's a little bit wonky, and there's actually like a strange little flip here on this edge. And that might cause problems in our mesh. And we're going to go ahead and look at the rest of the bottle here in a second once we get more set. But let's go ahead and move this to start with. And I'm going to go ahead and put this up here. And we'll see if I can just go ahead with this selected. I'm going to go ahead and see if I can select that, relax that again, and see if I get a better result. It looks like that actually fixed it. So now let me go ahead and move this. Okay, so I've got all the round sections done, which basically means now I'm at a point where I want to put all of these together on one tile, right? That's sort of the goal in the end, is that these all fit on one tile. Makes it a lot easier to work with. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Command or Control A when I'm in my texture editor view, which should select all of my polygon islands over here. I'm going to come down to UV packing, and I want to be in geometric mode. Resolution 2048 by 2048, gap size 2. Just double check all those settings. There's no other issues there. I'm going to hit apply. And what that's going to do is it's going to lump everything together in a single mesh, right? Now, I may not be 100% happy with how these are, put inside one another. And so what I may do in this case is I might, just because I know it's going to be annoying to texture these things when they're like that, I'm going to go ahead and double click on this inner island, which is the cap of the bottle. And I'm just going to go ahead and, I'm just going to go ahead and move it outside of that area. And this is also pretty small. This is where I could say, oh, I know I'm going to want more detail on the lid there. And so maybe I actually want to scale this up some so that it has a bit more potential for resolution. But I do want to make sure that it's kind of uniform with how much resolution I have on the surface of the bottle as well. With this, I could try and even things out a bit. You'll see things are a little bit more stretched and weird here in the top, but we're really just going to be placing a label on this surface. So having the amount of distortion here isn't going to be the end of the world. Okay, so I've got my UVs ready. I'm going to go ahead and save this as it's currently my LOD model prep mesh, and I'm just going to type in UV. So we know the UVs are ready to go. So we're at a good stopping point for this part of the tutorial. We've got this model ready to start working through with other meshes.